As you know, it's been traditional over the last 23 scientific retreats, and actually one additional retreat that we had that predated the official scientific retreat, so it's really at least our 24th time. It's been my privilege as the medical director of the Prostate Cancer Foundation since its inception, and having started this organization under the direction of Mike, to introduce him for what is always a memorable keynote speech that he gives. I'd like to just take 1 second, since we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and ask for a show of hands for everybody whose first time at PCF is this year. Well, that's extremely healthy. So there are a lot of people that haven't heard Mike speak. So let me give you a little preemptive information. Mike is the quintessential out-of-the-box thinker. Matter of fact, he totally lives out of the box and occasionally comes into the box to visit with us. And I challenge myself for ways to introduce him that are novel, and I've tried every conceivable way. So this year, I'm going to, I went back and looked at some of the previous talks that he's given, and I've tried to adopt some of his methodology. The first is he's very fond of quoting from literature and from things and showing information that has no relationship to the subject matter, but has a unique way of tying it together. So one of the quotes that he often uses in his talks is that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. For Jonathan's already given you the first stage of English literature introduction. This was obviously the beginning of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, and it really was, for those of you who are not English literature majors, was written around the time of the French Revolution and sought to contrast what was going on in London, what was going on in Paris at the time, and it became sort of a metaphor for hope, for misery and suffering versus hope and optimism. And he's used that many times in his speech, and I really kind of thought about it, and in a way that's what we're doing. We're dealing with misery and despair, and we're trying to get to a place of hope and optimism, which I think in this room we're at today. So I tried my hand at the literature game, and I came up with one, you'll pardon my French, but plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, which is from the satirical French magazine Le Figaro, and it was in the mid-1849, I believe, where it was first said. And I started to think, that's kind of metaphorically correct for where we're at. So over the last 24 years, as Jonathan's already eloquently stated, we've seen a period of tremendous expansion of the knowledge and the treatment of patients with prostate cancer. So a lot has changed. Namely, I think if you track the evolution of the PCF, and particularly the evolution of this particular meeting, which I always promise to tell you is the best one we've ever had, and I always say it, and I'm always right. The evolution of PCF is a surrogate, a marker for the development of the field of prostate cancer. It's just another way of saying what Jonathan's already showed you about the expansion of literature. The second point is we've had a fingerprint at PCF in the development of multiple new FDA-approved drugs. That was unheard of before the start of PCF, and the happy problem that we have today is to try to figure out how best to use those new drugs and what order how to sequence them. We have a wonderful Ironman Movember and PCF sponsored program to try to understand how these drugs are being used and how to integrate them into our therapeutic armamentarium. And the third thing that I think has been the most monumentally changing and is just in its infancy, but as you saw this morning in the roundtable on precision oncology, you saw really that prostate cancer is in the vanguard of the development of the ability to actually carry out what has been previously thought of as a pipe dream. So those are the things that are new. What about the things that have stayed the same? Mem shows. First, we had our first meeting in the Mansfield room in the Senate in 1993, and it was notable at that time, and these are facts extracted from Mike's talk at that time, We were at the beginning of Clinton 1 administration in February of 1993, and as a point of some potential symmetry, we may be at the beginning of the Clinton 2 presidency. We don't know, but if you read the polls, and it's likely. And that comes with a lot of things, some good, some bad, and some uncertain. One thing that we do know as deliverers of healthcare and people that work in this field, that initial election prompted the beginning of what was an ongoing and is an ongoing revolution in the way healthcare is delivered, the way it's financed, led to the Accountable Care Act, which is clearly a work in progress. So there's going to be continued disruption in the way we implement the things that bubble out of this meeting. Around that time, it also, and I think it's clearly the case today, is that the pharmaceutical industry, partly their own fault for some bad behavior, is under the threat of potential price controls, and that has put a chill in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology world. In Mike's initial address, he told us that you could buy 150 biotech companies for the same price that it would cost you to buy Merck. I'm not sure, and that was a pretty startling thing, obviously implying that there was a lot more value in 150 biotech companies than there was in Merck. And I think that is a prophecy that has certainly turned out to be correct. I'd be interested, I'll ask him a question before his talk, what he thinks that ratio might be today. And additionally, we still have the chronic problem of getting financing, having a financing mechanism for funding early stage companies, the kinds of companies that people like you who work in the labs would dream of starting, but the access to capital is somewhat limited at the present time. And finally, the chronic underfunding of science by our federal government is a continuing problem, as Jonathan's already showed you. So those are the things that stay the same. There's one additional thing that stays the same, and that in 1993, Mike Milken was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer. He decided not to take it lying down. He decided to form a foundation, the product of which you see in the room today. People question whether this would be a short-lived infatuation, a glamour project, and I think those questions have certainly been put to rest. He's clearly, almost 24 years later, the good news is he's free of disease, and the better news is he's continued to dedicate himself with endless time, energy, and intellect to helping us solve the problems and providing the right environment so that you can all do your work. So I'm very proud to invite him to the podium to tell us. I understand the title of his talk is The Quest for a Meaningful Life, which I'm certainly looking for, as I'm sure many of you are, and would like to find out his thoughts on the subject. So it's a pleasure to welcome our index patient, our collateral patient, our founder and chairman, Mike Milken.
Thank you, Skip, and it's great to be with you today. I'm not clicking anything up here. So I was thinking, for many of you, and I saw a number of hands go up. This is your first visit from almost the group of 600 that are with us. We've had 11 of these retreats in Lake Tahoe. 4 in D.C., 3 here in Carlsbad, 2 in Santa Barbara, 2 occurred in Scottsdale, Phoenix area, 1 in New York, and as Dr. Holden pointed out to you, our very first one that actually makes this the 24th, our very first one in Charlottesville, Virginia, and was held at John Kluge's home there. And as I think back over 24 previous addresses, as Skip reflected on the one in '93 in the Mansfield room, there were many efforts that we've made to take a look at the world, and I think many of you know my views that if you really sit down and think about it, most of us can predict the future. We don't know necessarily when it occurs, but whether last year the focus on science matters, or the year before the American dream and what is the American dream, as Skip alluded to, global changes in the world, the best of times, science was propelling forward, and the worst of times, lack of funding, particularly for young scientists. The promise of the 21st century, what we can count on, and one thing I'm sure is the elimination of cancer as a cause of death and suffering. 2010 asked, do we have the will? Do we have the will to solve many of the problems? That we have the technology? And 2009, with your participation and many others, creating a legacy of hope for so many. So today I was wrestling with what would be a topic, and with populism rampant throughout the world, not just in the United States, I thought the quest for a meaningful life would be a good topic for today. And let's start with what is a meaningful life from that standpoint. And in looking at how others have attempted to define a meaningful life in ways, always uplifting, Dostoevsky let us know that deprived of a meaningful work, men and women lose their reason for existence. They go stark, raving mad. So, that was the view from Russia a number of years ago. A more positive view was from Eleanor Roosevelt. The purpose of life, after all, is to live it, to taste the experience to the utmost, to reach out eagerly, without fear, for newer and richer experiences. Frankl pointed out, life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by a lack of meaning and purpose. And many of the things written by people that were in the Soviet Gulag pointed out, whether it was Solzhenitsyn or others, that even though they were confined, they were free to think about the future. And once they had physically lost everything, they had everything from that standpoint. So having meaning and purpose. So if one of our young researchers, when I was a third-year medical student, my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He had surgery, but unfortunately the cancer came back. Today he's doing great, but it was really led me to be interested in figuring out how we can find a cure. It's very personal. And our own Dr. Howard Sewell has been with me for almost 20 years as we've traveled the world together, focused on so many life-threatening diseases. To me, a meaningful life means helping others, having successful children, and a wonderful grandchild, someday I'll say grandchildren, and of course being healthy myself. And here's a fantastic picture of Morgan and Valentina on her first Halloween. So all of those of us that went to college or graduate school were introduced to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As when we think about a meaningful life, it starts with psychological, food, shelter, income, education. Then we move to higher levels, if we have that. In many talk about having enough income to meet those needs. Safety, what's the environment like? Love and belonging, friends, community, esteem, essential in this group. Our colleagues, our co-workers, and self-actualization at the top. This theme that what we achieved and what was important to us has become a reality. And as we go through those things, one of the greatest documents ever written was the Declaration of Independence. And it definitely pointed out those areas: life, these liberties, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And 20 years ago in one of our addresses, we added, of course, and good health along those lines to it. But many of you have already taken a different path in this area. And so I brought up to your attention a number of years ago something particularly for myself and my wife, Lori, and our family, and was one of the greatest motion pictures of all time, called West Side Story. Unbelievable music, but it was really the story of Romeo and Juliet. And for Lori and I, Romeo and Juliet was the 1968 version of Zeffirelli. And when I hear that song that Johnny Mathis later sang, it made me think back to the day we were getting married in 1968, and all I have to do is hear that song, and tears come to my eyes because I could identify with two young lovers that fate got in the way. But for most young girls in America in 1993 and around the world, Leonardo DiCaprio was their Romeo. Every girl, on average in America, between the ages of 11 and 18, saw this movie 3 times. So many of you know I asked you this quiz a long time ago, and let's see if you remember the correct answer. So which of the following Shakespeare plays was produced as a movie the most often in the 20th century? Was it Hamlet? Was it Macbeth? Was it King Lear? Was it Romeo and Juliet? Was it Taming of the Shrew? And it wasn't necessarily billed at that like West Side Story, but the story mirrored one of these 5 plays. So I've given you an opportunity to think about it. So let's start at the bottom. How many think it was Taming of the Shrew? As we remember Elizabeth Taylor and etc. Okay, we have a few, very few. How about Romeo and Juliet in any form? Anyone? We have a number. I've influenced maybe by showing you 3. King Lear. Okay, few. Macbeth. Many. Hamlet. Many. Well, let's see. It's hard to believe, but just in the United States, there were 8 Henry V's. There were 14 King Lears, 18 Julius Caesars, 37 Romeo and Juliets, 39 Macbeth, and 71 Hamlets. And so if you've studied these hierarchy of needs and what is a meaningful life, you can think, why is Shakespeare probably more popular today than he was almost 500 years ago? And it's not hard to understand because he wrote about these emotions, these human emotions, and whether it is love or whether it's about justice or friendship or wealth or the inner struggle or honor or in Romeo and Juliet, fate, prejudice, etc. These are with us today. Now, a large percent of you in the room have already taken this oath. And when it was first written many years ago, this Hippocratic Oath, it was not only a personal oath, but it was an oath to the gods. I swear by Apollo, the healer, and all the powers of healing, and call in witnesses all the gods and goddesses that I may keep this oath and promise to the best of my ability and judgment. I will use my power to help the sick. To the best of my ability and judgment, I will abstain from harming or wrongdoing any man by it. So for most of you, you've already reached the top of the pyramid when you took this oath to be a doctor. Not everyone moves in this way. And Henry Clay Frick, who you can visit one of the great museums if you visit New York, was one of the world's leading industrialists, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, who lost his daughter at a very young age, as one out of every 3 presidents of the United States has lost a child before the age of 5. He sold his holdings, became an extremely religious man, and had worshipped his daughter. All of his power, all of his wealth could not save his daughter's life. And you can see, if you visit that museum, how his life was so changed by that event, as we saw earlier, so many people that have chosen medical or that field to go into because of some member of their family. And when we think about those hierarchy of needs, you think about families in America and the middle class in America today. And today, because they are house poor, the government provided housing and incentives and told you to invest in real estate that you could not afford. It could not even keep up the payments quite often. That middle class in America, depending where you are, still spends in excess of 30% of their income on their housing unit, and in many areas it's almost 50%. And 18% on transportation. The average American spends $9,000 a year on their car. And when it's left over, there's very little money for the education of their children, and they only can afford to spend 2% on the education of their children. How different it still remains in Asia, where food is the number one expenditure by the middle class. The family most important expenditure of the middle class that's variable is the supplemental education of their child. And they spend as much on the education of their child because that is their commitment to the future. Much as Howard pointed out, his commitment to his children and his grandchildren. And so the average member of the middle class in Korea does not spend $9,000 on their car every year, but spends $8,000 for every child on supplemental education. And with that challenge and the loss of net worth by the middle class, we've reflected over the years, and I mention it again today, that America became poor. And today, even with the substantial increases in housing, median net worth in the United States is $50,000. Half the people in the United States, adults, have a net worth over 50, and half have a net worth under 50. That compares to the UK, which is dramatically higher, or Australia, or even Italy. Only Greece, because of the weakness, partly because of the euro, is median net worth lower. And so when you think about populism today, think about a large percentage of America, particularly, that is poor. Half of all households cannot cover a $400 unplanned emergency expense without selling something or borrowing. And as you think about populism, just think of the individuals who cannot afford their mortgage payment or their medical bills or their children's supplemental education if they lost their job or if someone became sick. And so it's not that hard in a democracy to understand substantial increases in populism that have occurred here and other places around the world. And those fears are fueled in many ways by technology. And as we step back and think about technology from a sense of disruption to a person's life. So today, and they announced yesterday, very strong results. 204 million emails are sent every minute. 204 million. 4 million searches. I couldn't be more excited about my research assistant, Mr. and Mrs. Google, and what they provide me today. 216,000 photos posted every minute and 48,000 apps downloaded on an iPhone or an iPad every minute. And a small company that's about to go public for $25 billion or more, Snapchat, went from 2 billion to more than 10 billion views in just 1 year. Over the last 2 decades, we've spent a great deal of time talking about the dramatic changes in cost, speed, storage, and access that have occurred around the world. But in a populist call, not just in the United States, but in Europe today, technology and innovation are disrupting industries that employ the vast majority of people. And so whether it's agriculture, whether it's communications, whether it's education, energy, environment, financial services, healthcare, medical research, and I would say real estate, retail, and distribution, this sharing economy and transportation. This brings fear to the dinner table of what is my purpose and what am I going to be doing and will I be able to meet commitments in the future. Let's take a look at just a few of them. Probably the greatest risk to employment in the world today lies in agriculture. And if we just step back and look at the United States, in 1800, 98% of the people in the United States lived on a farm. And for the most part, one person fed one person. 100 years later, 42% of the people in the United States lived on a farm. And each person fed 3. By 2000, less than 2% of the people in the United States not only lived on a farm, but were involved in agriculture itself. And as you start to think about the continent of Africa, parts of South America, Asia today, if we implemented modern technology, implementing just one intervention of precision agriculture, yes, precision agriculture like we talk about precision medicine, reduces water usage by 50% and increases yields by 16%. Vertical farming, hydro farming, modern technology and equipment. In Argentina, in the last few months, an individual had bought 10 farms, analyzed using big data what was the best crop for yielding on those farms. Put all 10 farms together, went to one crop, in this case soybeans, and discovered with one person with modern technology, he could plant all the soybeans and harvest all the soybeans. They went from almost 800 workers to 1 with this investment. Hundreds of millions of jobs are potentially at risk using modern agriculture today, and I assure you it'll be resisted in most countries for the fear of what purpose do those individuals have in life? What are they doing? Until we find other opportunities and jobs. Finance. So it isn't just the farm worker. All of us remember when we used to go to a bank and deposit our check or to withdraw money. 21st century banking has a much different face and look to it. And if you visit Kenya or some of the other countries in the world, you can get a look at 21st century finance, where your mobile device is your bank and your phone, and there's literally little currency changing hands. So let's talk about another endangered job and species, and that is the stockbroker. So let's think about that stockbroker. Right now, most of our politicians aren't worried about this individual. When I went to Wall Street, 1968, late 1960s, one of the wealthiest individuals was the equity salesman. There were fixed commissions. They were 1%. And so let's take a look if you wanted to buy 5 shares of Berkshire Hathaway. So you woke up in the morning and said, okay, I want to invest, and I want to invest with Warren Buffett. So I am going to invest and buy 5 shares. Now I noticed that amount, which says, looks to me like it says 1,841,000 is really 1,000,008. It's not 1,800, it's just 1,841,000. So a 1% commission was almost $11,000. So you called up, you said you wanted to buy $1 million worth approximately of Berkshire Hathaway, and your broker made $11,000. Now what happens today? When you call them up and tell them that you want to buy 5 shares of Berkshire Hathaway, if you don't have negotiating power and get the price lower, you're going to have to pay the outrageous commission of $7.95. So you've gone from almost $11,000 to $7.95. It's almost impossible to support families today based on the level of commissions of a few pennies that exist. And so over 500,000 jobs have been lost in the financial service industry. In terms of money management with ETFs today, you can buy ETFs with close to a 0 fee. Okay, close to a 0 fee today. And so the question is, what's happening to actively manage mutual funds with the new labor regulations in America? Even if you're the best performing fund, if you're a small business and you put on the list a fund that has the best performance but higher fees, you have to explain to the Labor Department why you have had a high-cost money manager on the list in your 401k for your employees. And in the first half, just of this year, $250 billion has left actively managed equity and gone into ETFs or other types of investments where computers are building the portfolio. The equity researcher, the portfolio manager, the salesman, all elements of this industry are under significant pressure today. And let's step back for a moment and just think about prostate cancer. In 1992, we had the first prostatectomy performed here robotically. By 2009, there were 85,000 prostatectomies in the United States, 86%, or 73,000 of them were robotic assistants. And if I think back to my conversations with Dr. Holden, who led his group as a surgeon, and many of the other leaders around the world who did traditional surgery, the first response is, we don't necessarily know if this minimally invasive robotic surgery will have the same outcome. The second response is, I don't think I can perform it. You know, I don't play video games. I don't do those things. I don't know if I can learn. People like Peter Carroll did, but most of the others did not. And so today, more than 90% of all prostatectomies are minimally invasive. And when it's performed with people that are excellent practitioners, as we all know today, there's obviously less blood loss, less trauma to the body, less scarring, hospital stays are shorter, and recovery times are faster. And so there were 400,000 robotic surgeries of some kind performed in the United States in 2012. This rate is growing at 25% a year, and the market of medical robotic systems is expected to reach $18 billion annual compound revenue growth, with prices coming down of 13%. So obviously, when we raised this issue in 1993, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on, going into 2001 about the future, and it was clear what the future was, I know all of you said, well, I'm going to go out and buy Intuitive Surgical. And so in 2011, when we had a meeting, the stock was selling for approximately $6. It had a revenue of 20 some odd million. They were losing over $200 million a year. They had sales that were relatively low, 20 million or so, and an enterprise value of 220 million. So what has happened today? The stock is up 100-fold. Revenue is up more than 100-fold. Profitability has increased dramatically from negative to more than $1 billion. Revenue has increased dramatically 100-fold. And the value of the company has increased 100-fold. So yes, we had a disruptive technology, but all of us could have participated had we chosen in this technology, if not to do robotic surgeries, at least as investors in that area. And so when you look at media today, we're constantly hearing about the power of Disney or Fox or Time Warner or Sony or CBS. But today in media, Apple is worth more than all the media industry combined. And Google's on the verge of becoming worth more than those. And Facebook has 1.5 billion people. More than 1 billion come every day. And so there is a challenge out there. How do these household names compete in the 21st century, where they might not even know who their customer is and interact with far fewer people? And so earlier this week, you had an announcement of AT&T and Time Warner, not Time Warner Cable, but Time Warner combining. And so both of them under extreme competition in their businesses. And their attempt here to combine is partly an attempt to compete with other companies. So many years ago, and we'll see how many of you remember, I had asked the question, what is the most valuable real estate in the world? And all of these 6 cities have claimed that they had the most valuable real estate in the world. Whether it's New York, or whether it's Singapore, or whether it's London, or whether it's Dubai, San Francisco, or Hong Kong. So I'll let you think about it for just a couple seconds. And how many of you think it's New York? Anyone think it's New York? Well, we have some hands. How about Singapore? How many of you have ever been to Singapore? Okay, good. All right. London. How about London? What about Dubai? Okay, few. How about San Francisco, the center today? Dr. Holden's voting for San Francisco. And what about Hong Kong? Okay, a large group for Hong Kong. Well, if any of you picked any of those 6 locations, you could easily have a very difficult 21st century. Because none of those locations have valuable real estate. The most valuable real estate in the world generally ends in .com. 7 billion people can come visit you. They can be in their pajamas. They don't even have to get dressed. They put a piece of Kleenex over the picture so you can't see that they're in their pajamas or nightgown. And Facebook has 1.7 billion people that come and visit them or their various entities. So let's go back and look, and it looks like my first economic lesson didn't take effect. So let's look at a company that felt just like you that physical real estate was important. That company was called Blockbuster. And in 2002, not too long ago, it had a $4.5 billion value. They had 7,000 locations in the United States. No one could compete with them. They had the most number of customers. They had the best pricing power. They bought the most DVDs or VHS tapes. No one could compete. But you had this little company go public called Netflix. It was not worth very much, $160 million at the time, and they had a different idea. It wasn't necessarily the best idea right up front because they were thinking they could depend on the U.S. mail, okay? And so they'll put a DVD in the mail and just mail it to you. Well, let's see how it worked out. Well, today Netflix is worth $54 billion, and they found a better form of distribution. They do it electronically. And not only is Blockbuster worth 0, the senior secured debt of Blockbuster got 2 cents on the dollar. And all that real estate that they own became a liability, not an asset. So let's look at another one, a company that I had financed, Barnes & Noble. So in 1997, it took 1.5 Amazons to make one Barnes & Noble. And if you were reading your newspaper, you could see, very simply, why Barnes & Noble may crush Amazon. Anything Amazon can do on the internet, so can Barnes & Noble. That's what Blockbuster said. Barnes & Noble fate doesn't rest on its website. Amazon does. And once you look beyond the website, you've begun to see why, in this battle at least, the odds favor the $3 billion a year Goliath called Barnes & Noble. Well, let's see how that worked out. Okay, so Barnes & Noble's worth $800 million today, about half of what it was worth, and Amazon, as of yesterday, was worth almost $380 billion, and the 6th most valuable company in the world. So not embracing and not fully understanding 21st century technology probably didn't lead you to invest into it. Probably didn't lead you to invest in Amazon, maybe, or even Netflix. But let's talk about the most powerful company in the world, Walmart. They do almost $500 billion in business, $500 billion in business. They have put fear and all other forms of retail under significant pressure over the past 40 plus years. So last year and early this year, they announced that they are actually going to close stores, 269 Walmart stores, 154 of them in the United States. And at the same time they're announcing that, Amazon Air Prime is announcing drones are going to carry 5-pound packages over 10 miles in 30 minutes to deliver them to you. So let's look at Walmart, which has 2 million employees, and Amazon, that's now over 200,000. Walmart's trailing revenue, $485 billion. revenue at Amazon now is $130 billion. So Amazon is now approximately 30 or so percent of Walmart. In profitability, Walmart 33 plus billion in EBITDA, and Amazon 13. So they're about 40% there now. In market cap, 215 billion for Walmart and approaching 390 billion for Amazon. So Amazon's worth almost twice as much as Walmart when you look at it today. So what does Walmart do? And if you were leading Walmart, and it's not just Walmart, let's look at some of the largest companies in the United States and some around the world. Macy's, Walmart, Sony, IBM. So if you're Walmart and they say your company is worth about $100,000 an employee, what can you do? Well, you can't really afford to give too many benefits to your employees because you're being valued at $100,000 per employee. You want to increase their wages. Every dollar a year in increase, just $1, costs Walmart $4 billion. Can they raise their prices? Can they pass that on? Difficult if they're going to be competing with Amazon or other companies today. Hard to push those. Or Macy. Let's go look at Facebook at the other extreme. Today, Facebook is being valued at $26 million per employee. Can you offer them free breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Sure. Can you take their kids to school and pick them up? Sure. Can you do their laundry? Sure. Can you set up and do their tax returns? Sure. Okay? And all the other things that might make a little difference to an employee. Can you tell them that, yes, they can work their hours, midnight to 8 in the morning is what they like to work? Fine. But it's very difficult to compete. When I was much younger, I remember seeing this Paul Bunyan Disney video where Paul and his blue ox were challenged by a shady character with a chainsaw and a railroad car. And no matter how big Paul was and how great he was, there was a day that he couldn't beat the 90-pound weakling with a chainsaw and distributing with a rail car. So what has Walmart done? No different than AT&T and Time Warner. They announced earlier this year that they're going to buy Jet. They're going to buy a company that attempts to compete with Walmart. And Jet's strategy is that you don't have to go buy a 5-pound jar of mayonnaise, to get a low price at Costco or some other place. They'll ship you a small jar by breaking them into small units and delivering them to you. Time will tell how it works. Historically, it has not worked where companies of 20th century or 19th or 18th century, no matter how efficient, compete with companies using technology today and what you can do in a warehouse. So let's see how we do on the next question. Last one we didn't do that well. Okay, excellent on the first. A recent NPR report detailed that the most common job in each state from 1978 to 2014, which job ranked number one in more states than any other? 1, teacher. 2, secretary. 3, truck driver. 4, customer service representative. 5, software developer. Okay, you've had a chance. Let's take a look. Which job ranked number one in more states during this period of time? Was it teacher? Well, we gave you the answer. Okay, there it goes. You all got it right. Okay. Truck driver. So when you wake up in the morning and you read about driverless cars, driverless trucks, driverless forklifts, driverless trains, it might not affect any of us, but that member of the middle class or lower middle class or even upper middle class, that's your job. It affects them. What is their future? What are they going to be doing a decade from now? What's going to happen to their family? And so as you think of a service industry today, those of us that live in Los Angeles and those that root for the Dodgers, you might have seen that game where Gonzalez was safe at first. The umpire called him out, and after they reviewed it, they still called him out. One thing I'm sure of is the computer would have called him safe from that standpoint. And so as we think about the promise of the future and the promise of bioscience, it isn't just truck drivers and it isn't just people in the financial service industry. You know, what is a radiologist thinking when he opened the paper and see that a computer might be able to read an MRI or a CAT scan better than any individual human being can read it? Initially, you feel the same as the surgeon did in 1992 or 1993. You know, I don't believe it. They don't have the skill. But I think it's inevitable that these things are going to occur. And so when we think about the promise of bioscience, one of the things that I want to stress for each of you, and I've done it almost every year, is just we need to remind ourselves that public health and medical research has been accountable for more than 50% of all economic growth in the last 200 years. And as you move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the number one factor that has driven people to move up that pyramid has been advances in health. And as we think about evolution and 4 million years of evolution, average life expectancy on this planet was only extended by 11 years. And in the last 114 to 115 years, we've extended it by 40 years, average life expectancy. Obviously, and it's not just extension of life expectancy, it's improvement in the quality of life. The greatest achievement of mankind, by far. And as you look at this little circle that holds more than half the people on the planet and has driven the world's economy over the last generation, life expectancy in that little circle went from 43 to 75 in 2 generations. Howard Sewell and myself and many of you in this room now live long enough to see our grandchildren due to the extension. And not only live long enough to see, but to spend time and pass our ideas and beliefs to our grandchildren. What caused this increase? Vastly improved sanitation, development of antibiotics, implementation of vaccines, and so on. And many diseases we have essentially eliminated. Not everyone has the same confidence in the future that you and I do. So let's look at the New York Times. They pointed out in 1987, today about 500 human genes, less than 1%, have been decoded. Even a steady rise in the rate of sequencing would leave the job unfinished until the 22nd century. Well, what happened? Speed increased 1 million-fold, cost dropped to 1/1000th of what it was. And today, as you can look at other forms, the sequencing of the genome has accelerated much faster at much lower cost than even our data storage. At the PCF, we looked at this in 1993. The incidence of prostate cancer was growing. Expected increase dramatically due to aging of society in the United States alone, and 40,000 men died. And as Skip and Jonathan pointed out, we had our very first awards in 1993 in the Mansfield Room. And there's Snuffy Myers in his uniform that he wore to all of our events, and Andy von Eschenbach and others. We had our first retreat at John Kluge's home. And as we reflect on what was the background of the people that went to that retreat, well, there were MDs, there were PhDs, and there were a couple molecular biologists. And what is your group that's with us all today? Well, that's been expanded dramatically, and we now have microbiologists, not just molecular biologists, and veterinarians and ethicists and physicists and so on that make up. In 1995, we put on the first ever cancer summit to try to drive increases in the NCI budget and a focus by our country, the U.S., and other countries. With Lee Hood, I stayed up almost all night trying to think for this event, how can we rethink the war on cancer? As we made a list of 10 things we could do, and as you reflect on the last 20 years, almost all of them have become commonplace today. In 96, 97, and 98 at the Prostate Cancer Foundation, we said to ourselves, we cannot bet on one technology. We made a list of 17 things to bet on. We didn't know which ones would have the highest payoff, but we did know that we were going to focus on nutrition and immunology and a bunch of other fields from that standpoint. To collect data, therapeutic, clinical teams were created around. And then in 98, it culminated 3 years of work. And the Prostate Cancer Foundation put on the march, brought all cancer organizations to Washington, 500,000 people, not only in Washington, but around the United States. And later that year, the president signed into law a doubling of the NIH, a tripling of the NCI, increases in FDA, National Science Foundation, CDC, CMS, and others. Jonathan so eloquently discussed the role of the young investigators, and we recently did a study going back 30 years, long before the founding of the prostate cancer, and many of our early Young Investigator Awards, much of which Howard worked on, Howard Sewell with me. It was interesting, but the late stage awards, those kind of career achievement awards, you found only 7% were still active. Mid-level awards, 75%. And the astonishing thing, 30 years later, every single young investigator was still working in medical research, 100%. This program was kicked off many years ago when I was sitting at dinner with Steve Rosenberg, who told me he didn't have enough money to rent a Winnebago to take his wife, his 3 daughters, and his mother-in-law to visit the national parks. And so our goal was, can we keep you in the laboratories? Can we empower you? And each generation today, as Jonathan pointed out, has accomplished so much. And it's not just here in the U.S., but young investigators throughout the world. And when we think about many of the things that people declared were failures, we found that they were very useful in another purpose or repositioning those today. And I think as we all well know, and Jonathan has pointed out to you, numerous drugs have been approved today. So when we think of the prostate cancer then and now, 70% of men were diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer, and often diagnosed when they were experiencing symptoms such as back pain. Now, most men are diagnosed in routine exams. Only 5% have advanced disease, and the survival rate for 5 years and longer is 99%. And so when we think about the future, we have to go back and reflect on how do we get the capital to allow us to move. At one time, we could count on one individual donor. If we go back centuries and look at that one individual donor, we can see the Medici family. And as you step back and just realize what an unbelievable contribution they made to civilization, and whether it was funding Leonardo da Vinci or whether it was funding Raphael or Galileo, etc., from that standpoint. We have many of those today, those individuals. They make up 3%, collectively, all of us, of medical research, that venture philanthropy. Now, this concept just didn't start, last year. If we go back in time and take a look, when the American Committee for the Statue of Liberty ran out of money for the statue's pedestal in 1884, they ran an ad in the newspaper, i.e. crowdsourcing, using technology of the time, the newspaper. And 125,000 citizens donated $1 or less, and they raised $100,000. Now, as Dr. Holden pointed out, we got this idea, we're going to use modern technology. In 1995, we're going to use the television. Okay, and we're going to go on television, myself and Dr. Holden and Lee Hood, but we brought a secret weapon, General Schwarzkopf, with us on that show. And Hopkins had spent 12 years collecting data, and we, in 1 week, had collected more data on families that had multiple people with prostate cancer in 1 week than they had in 12 years, using that modern new invention, the television. And having General Schwarzkopf was a positive, because many people just called to report to duty, and no one had prostate cancer in their family. They were just calling to report. And we've used this leverage in many ways. If I just outline a few drugs here, we've been able to leverage the funds from the Prostate Cancer Foundation 50-fold, 60-fold, and more. So one of my favorite quotes came from Archimedes. He said, "Give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world." Well, we are the levers that will cure disease and change the world. And using a little bit more in crowdsourcing and community, we partnered with Movember, that has raised over $700 million since 2003 with your help. The Prostate Cancer Foundation has raised about $660,000, and we all look forward to Howard's mustache and Jonathan's every year. Our home run challenge, we've raised $47 million going to 409 ballparks, seeing the decimation of the healthy diet as we travel from one ballpark to another. This year we had a chance to visit the new hamburger offered in Philadelphia. 9 hamburgers, 9 different kinds of cheese piled on one bun with a thin piece of lettuce and 1 slice of tomato. So you ask yourself, how do they expect you to eat 9 hamburgers piled on top of each other? Well, many of you have seen those press juices that they press to give you, natural juice. Well, they have one of those presses for this. They press it together so it's thin enough that you can squeeze in 1,800 calories and almost 100 grams of saturated fat in one sandwich. Safeway, we went out and with the help of our board member, Steve Bird, devised a way that individuals in a supermarket could make a contribution. 83 million raised for prostate cancer, average contribution $2. And so We've raised $660 million. We've leveraged that with $10 billion in matching funds, recruited you and others around the world, $100 billion in capital, social capital, incalculable. Now, are we the first to advocate today crowdsourcing? No. The first crowdsourcing, you might or might not know, occurred in 1879. Okay, an agreement to publish a dictionary, submissions sought from John Q. Public. It took 50 years. And then we published in 1929 the first complete edition, 6 million submissions. A few years ago, the Ice Bucket Challenge. 1.2 million videos posted. Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and others. 2.2 million mentions on Twitter. 2.9 million views on the ALS. And raised $115 million for this effort. Kickstarter, GoFundMe, crowdsourcing, and others have all started here raising money. And so when I personally visited many of you in '93 and saw that 1/3 of your time was spent writing reports in order to raise money, our focus was, can we essentially increase your productivity 50% by reducing the time and energy you take to raise money? And so today is our launch of Many versus Cancer that Jonathan referred to. And so we are moving totally into the 21st century. And we hope each of you can become a member so you can help launch Many, man and a Y, Many versus Cancer, and recruit people you know to share our mission to end prostate cancer. So yes, there are donors, and we are very lucky. And at level 1, you can find a donor that'll give you $1 million a year for 5 years, and you can raise $5 million. Well, but you could move to level 2. And you could find a bigger group of people that instead of giving you $1 million a year, could give you $100,000 a year for 5 years. And each of them can find 10 friends who'll give you $100,000 a year for 5 years. And that will be $5.5 million, an increase of $500,000, going from 1 person to 11. Or you can get to level 3. And so instead of asking for $1 million or 10,000, okay, we're going to try to get a different group. This is the 10,000 group. There's a lot more of them than the $1 million or 100,000 a year. And ask them each to find 10 friends, and each of their 10 friends to find 10. And with 111 donors, we can raise $5,550,000, an increase of $50,000. Or we could go to level 4 and ask people, are you willing to sign up to give $1,000 a year, knowing that we will leverage it many times over? Our history is 16-fold. And then get them, each of them, to find 10 friends, and each of those to find 10, and each of those to find 10. And can we find 1,111 donors who will give us $1,000 a year for 5 years? And we'll raise $5,555,000, an increase of $5,000. So all of those are excellent. But as you know, we're interested in going to the 7th level, the highest we can achieve in self-actualization. And so we ask and believe everyone can give us $100 a year for 5 years. And ask each of them to find friends they can give $100, and each of that group to give 100 and the next and the next. And when we're all done, we'll have 1,111,100 donors. And we'll raise 555,555,500. And so it's the power of many. It's the power of the internet and not asking for large amounts of money. And as you know, in the election in America in 2008, 1,000 donors giving you $1 million was $1 billion. But it was 1,000 votes. 1 million donors, 1 million donors giving you 1,000 was $1 billion. But 10 million donors, 10 million giving you $100 was $1 billion. But it was also 10 million votes. And so our strategy in many is to try to create this level. When we're all done with the whole group, and you can see the last level gives us an increase of 500 million plus. So yes, we are on the search for those that will give us $1 million for these challenge awards and young investigators for 5 years. We're on the search for that group that will give us 100,000. We're on the search for those that will give us 10, and on the search that those that will give us 1. But the real strength of this effort is to find individuals who are willing to commit $100 for 5 years and find 10 friends who would match it. And as you can see here, it's not hard with math. As I reflect over the past 23 and a half years, there are many that have done a great deal. Few more than Ward Tripp Cassells, who was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer at 49. I met him for the first time at Houston at one of our home run challenge games. And he put on his jersey eventually and carried it for the next 11 years. I met his children, Sam, who was 10, Henry, who was 5, and Lily, who was 3. His prognosis was poor, but he had a will to live. His kids joined us in Baltimore and other places at that home run challenge over the years. He became the board member of the PCF and regularly attended our meetings. Here's a picture of him in Lake Tahoe. He started 2 companies, created thousands of jobs in the bioscience area. He managed and led the efforts to take care of medical troops with 2 tours of duty in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He became the Assistant Secretary of Defense, went to Walter Reed when it had problems, and during that leadership eventually took responsibility for the health of every person that had served in the military. He lived 11 years. He changed the world. He participated in every form of clinical trial during that period of time. He was the doctor for President Bush 41 and 43 as it related to cardiology. And when I think of Tripp, I think of his children, 10, 5, and 3. And the fact he lived 11 years, they will be different, their children will be different. So not only the world, but the family. There are many others over this 23 years that made substantial commitments. Leslie Misrock, Bill Schwartz, Judah Folkman, Andy Grove, Mickey Tarnopol, Gary Becker, Ken Corey, Jerry Murphy, Larry Stupsky, and many others. Many, many others. Carl Linder. Their lives were extended, they enriched the world substantially, and I feel achieved the highest level in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I reflect upon one of our researchers almost exactly 10 years ago at our scientific retreat. When I was 5 years old, my father was given 18 months to live, the same as I was. He was fortunate to receive excellent care, and years later was able to join me at my college graduation. Why wouldn't a father wish that he could live long enough to see his son graduate? Since childhood, I considered researchers to be heroes. I felt an obligation to do something to make people's lives better. That's why I've dedicated my life, my research, so that my sons would have to ask, what was prostate cancer? That young researcher 10 years ago is Dr. Jonathan Simons today, the CEO of the Prostate Cancer Foundation. I cannot thank every one of you enough for the gift of life to me and millions of others. There's 1.4 million men living in the United States today that were projected to have passed away. There's 4 to 6 million of them living normal lives. And I'm no different than them or you. Was I going to see my children grow up? They were young, not as young as Trip Cassell's, but young, and I lived long enough and have to see them all married. Was I going to see grandchildren? Was I going to get to meet my own grandchildren as Howard Sewell has met his daughter at their first Halloween? Could I take them all to one of our home run challenge games? Now that we have 9, they can run and play every position. And something else you gave me. In 1964, the free speech movement, I had my pledge class at Berkeley. 22 of us. One of our assignments was to raise money to bail everyone out of jail. Over 1,000 people. It was a friendly demonstration. I can't tell you it was a challenge to raise the money, since many people got out for 50 cents. But I've now lived long enough to meet with my fraternity brothers and pledge brothers as we went back to Berkeley to relive that experience 50 years later. Many of them I had not seen for 50 years, so I say thank you. And as Jackie Robinson pointed out, and I watched that movie 42 the other day, life is not important except in its impact it has on other lives. And that allows you to achieve that level that Maslow talks about, or we talk about as the 7th level. And in closing, so many dreams, just so many dreams at first seem impossible. Just surviving, just living. Then they seem improbable. And then when we summon our will, they soon become inevitable. And with your work, the elimination of prostate cancer is inevitable. Thank you very much.